Don't you dare walk away from me! Brandon's voice echoed through the crowded mall corridor as Grace clutched her 8-month pregnant belly. Grace Michelle Thompson had been looking forward to this lunch date all week. At 30 years old and heavily pregnant, simple pleasures like meeting her husband at the mall had become rare treats. Her swollen feet ached in the designer shoes Brandon insisted she wear, even though comfortable flats would have been more practical for her condition. She navigated through the bustling Millbrook shopping center, one hand supporting her lower back, the other resting protectively on her rounded stomach. The baby had been particularly active today, as if sensing her excitement about spending time with Brandon. It had been months since they'd done anything together that didn't involve his work or his constant phone calls. Grace had even dressed carefully, choosing a flowing maternity dress in soft blue that complemented her eyes and made her feel beautiful despite her pregnancy weight gain. She spotted Brandon near Tiffany and Company, his tall frame unmistakable in his expensive gray suit. Her heart lifted at the sight of him until she realized he wasn't alone. Victoria Rose Palmer, his 26-year-old executive assistant, stood beside him at the jewelry counter, her sleek black hair falling in perfect waves over her shoulders. She wore a form-fitting red dress that emphasized every curve Brandon's pregnant wife no longer possessed. Grace approached slowly, confusion clouding her features. Brandon was examining an elaborate diamond necklace, discussing its merits with the sales associate, while Victoria leaned against him with obvious familiarity. Her perfectly manicured hand rested on his arm as she laughed at something he whispered in her ear. "Brandon," Grace called softly, her voice barely audible over the mall's ambient noise. He turned, and instead of the warm smile she expected, his expression hardened with annoyance. Victoria's lips curved into a smirk that sent ice through Grace's veins. "Grace," Brandon said curtly, making no move to step away from Victoria. "You're early." "I thought we were having lunch," Grace said, her pregnancy hormones making her voice shakier than usual. "What are you doing here?" Victoria answered before Brandon could speak. "Brandon's buying me a little thank you gift for all my hard work lately." She gestured toward the diamond necklace with mock innocence. "I've been putting in so many extra hours, haven't I?" "Darling." The endearment hit Grace like a physical blow. She looked at Brandon, waiting for him to correct Victoria, to explain that this was some kind of misunderstanding. Instead, he avoided her eyes and continued examining the jewelry. "Brandon, what's going on?" Grace's voice grew stronger, drawing attention from nearby shoppers. A tall security guard in his 50s had been watching the scene unfold from his position near the mall directory. Something about the pregnant woman's distressed posture and the man's dismissive attitude had caught his attention. His name tag read Bill, and his weathered face showed the kind of concern that came from years of protecting people. "This is exactly why I need Victoria," Brandon snapped, finally facing his wife. "You've become impossible since you got pregnant. Everything has to be about you and your needs." Grace gasped, stumbling backward as if he'd struck her. Several shoppers had stopped to stare, their conversations dying as they sensed drama unfolding. The security guard moved closer, positioning himself where he could intervene if necessary. "Brandon, how can you say that?" Grace's eyes filled with tears. "I'm carrying your baby." Victoria laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "Oh, honey, that's exactly the problem. Look at yourself. You're fat, emotional, and frankly, exhausting to be around." The security guard's jaw clenched as he watched Victoria deliberately step closer to Brandon, her hand sliding possessively down his arm. When Brandon didn't pull away, didn't defend his wife, Bill's expression grew thunderous. Grace felt the baby respond to her distress with a series of sharp kicks. She pressed both hands to her belly, trying to calm herself for the child's sake even as her world crumbled around her. "How long?" she whispered, the question barely audible. "How long what?" Brandon's tone was mocking now, emboldened by Victoria's presence and the public nature of the confrontation. "How long have you been sleeping with her?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Shoppers had formed a loose circle around them, some pretending to browse nearby stores while openly eavesdropping. The security guard moved even closer, his radio ready in case the situation escalated. Victoria answered with deliberate cruelty. "Long enough to know what he's been missing at home." She rose on her tiptoes and kissed Brandon full on the lips. Her eyes locked on Grace's horrified face throughout the embrace. Brandon didn't resist. If anything, he seemed to enjoy the public display of his betrayal. Grace felt something break inside her chest, a pain so sharp it took her breath away. The baby kicked frantically, as if trying to comfort her from within. She gripped the edge of a nearby bench for support, her knees threatening to buckle. "Mrs. Are you all right?" The security guard's voice was gentle but concerned. He moved to her side, his presence solid and reassuring in a way that made her want to cry. "She's fine," Brandon said dismissively, not bothering to look at his wife. "Grace, you're making a scene. Go home." But Grace wasn't fine, and she wasn't going home. Something in Victoria's triumphant smile and Brandon's casual cruelty ignited a fire she didn't know she possessed. "You're right," she said, her voice steadying as she straightened to her full height. "I am making a scene, and I'm just getting started." Brandon's face flushed red with embarrassment as more shoppers gathered to watch the unfolding drama. He strode over to Grace and grabbed her arm roughly, his fingers digging into her soft flesh through the fabric of her maternity dress. "That's enough," he hissed, pulling her closer. "You're embarrassing both of us." Grace tried to wrench free from his grip, but pregnancy had made her slower, more vulnerable. "Let go of me, Brandon. We need to talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Victoria and I are together now. You need to accept that and figure out how to handle it like an adult." The security guard stepped forward, his entire demeanor shifting from casual observer to protective authority. "Sir, I need you to let go of the lady." Brandon glanced at him dismissively. "This is between me and my wife. Mind your own business. Rent a cop. Actually, when you're physically restraining someone in my mall, it becomes my business." Bill's voice carried an unmistakable command that made several onlookers take notice. This wasn't the typical security guard's nervous intervention. This was someone accustomed to being obeyed. Victoria sensed the shift in power dynamics and moved to reassert control. She laughed loudly, making sure everyone could hear her. "Oh, please, Grace is just being dramatic because she can't compete anymore. Look at her." She gestured dismissively at Grace's pregnant form. "She trapped Brandon with that baby, and now she's angry that he's found someone who actually takes care of herself." Grace felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but they were tears of rage now rather than hurt. "Trapped him? We've been married for 3 years. Victoria, we planned this pregnancy." "Did you?" Victoria's smile was venomous. "Because Brandon told me a very different story about how you accidentally forgot your birth control." The lie hit Grace like a physical blow. She had never done such a thing, had never needed to. Brandon had been the one pushing for a baby, talking about their future family, making plans for the nursery. Now he stood silent, allowing Victoria to rewrite their history for an audience of strangers. "That's not true," Grace said, her voice breaking. "Brandon, tell her that's not true." Brandon's silence was answer enough. In that moment, Grace understood that his betrayal went far deeper than just an affair. He had constructed an entire false narrative to justify his actions, painting her as manipulative and desperate while casting himself as the victim. The realization must have shown on her face because Brandon's expression hardened further. "Don't look at me like that. Grace, you know what you did." "I didn't do anything except love you and trust you," Grace replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Love," Brandon laughed harshly. "You call that love constant demands, emotional manipulation, using your pregnancy to control every situation." The accusations were so far from Grace's reality that she could only stare at him in shock. She had been nothing but supportive throughout their marriage, had given up her marketing career to support his business ambitions, had never once used her pregnancy as anything other than a source of joy they were supposed to share. "You're rewriting history," she said quietly, "and you know it." That seemed to snap something inside Brandon. His grip on her arm tightened painfully, and his face contorted with anger. "Don't you dare call me a liar in front of all these people." "Then stop lying," Grace shot back, adrenaline overriding her usual desire to avoid confrontation. The security guard moved closer, his hand resting on his radio. "Sir, you need to release her arm right now." "Or what?" Brandon turned his attention to Bill, his corporate arrogance in full display. "You'll call the real police. I'm Brandon Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Construction. I employ half the contractors in this city. You really want to mess with me over some domestic dispute?" The threat hung in the air like a challenge. Grace could see the crowd of onlookers growing, phones appearing as people began recording the confrontation. Her humiliation was becoming public entertainment, and Brandon didn't seem to care. Victoria stepped closer to Brandon, sliding her arm through his free one in a gesture of ownership. Maybe Grace should just accept reality and stop making things difficult for everyone. Reality. Grace's voice cracked with emotion. The reality is that my husband is buying jewelry for his mistress while I'm 8 months pregnant with his child. Alleged child, Victoria said with calculated cruelty. The words hit Grace like a slap. Brandon still hadn't denied Victoria's implication, hadn't defended his wife or his unborn child. Instead, he seemed to be enjoying Grace's pain, feeding off her public humiliation. That's when Grace made the mistake of trying to pull away from him one more time, her maternal instincts demanding she protect herself and her baby from this toxic situation. Brandon's response was swift and shocking. The slap echoed through the mall corridor like a gunshot. Grace stumbled backward, her hand flying to her cheek as the crowd gasped collectively. She caught herself on a nearby bench, her other hand protectively cradling her belly as the baby responded to her distress with frantic movement. For a moment, the entire mall seemed to hold its breath. Then chaos erupted. "That's assault," someone shouted from the crowd. "Call security. Someone call the police." The security guard was already moving, his radio in his hand and his face thunderous with rage. "This is Bill requesting immediate police backup to the jewelry wing. We have an assault in progress." Brandon seemed to realize what he'd done, his hand still raised from the blow. But instead of apologizing, his corporate training kicked in. "She attacked me first. Everyone saw her trying to hit me." The lie was so blatant, so obviously false to everyone who had witnessed the encounter, that several people in the crowd began shouting denials. "That's not what happened. He grabbed her first. She never touched him." Victoria, sensing that the situation had spiraled beyond their control, tried to manage the narrative. "Grace has been stalking us for weeks. She's unstable. Look how she's acting." But the crowd had seen the truth. They had watched an 8-month pregnant woman get slapped by her husband while his mistress encouraged the violence. No amount of spin could change what they had witnessed. Grace sat on the bench, her cheek burning from the blow, her baby moving frantically inside her. The security guard knelt beside her, his presence somehow comforting despite the chaos surrounding them. "Ma'am, are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" His voice was gentle, professional, but Grace could hear an undercurrent of protective fury that seemed personal. She looked up at him through her tears, noting the concern in his weathered face, the way he positioned himself between her and Brandon without making it obvious. There was something about him that felt safe in a way nothing else had in months. "I don't understand," she whispered, the words meant for herself but audible to him. "How did my life become this?" The security guard's expression softened further. "Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who hurt us worst," he said quietly. "But that doesn't mean you're alone." Grace looked into his eyes and saw something she hadn't expected: recognition. Not recognition of her face, but recognition of her situation, her pain, her need for protection. It was as if he understood exactly what she was going through in a way that went beyond professional duty. Behind them, Brandon was arguing with other mall security who had arrived in response to Bill's radio call. Victoria was on her phone, probably calling lawyers or trying to manage the public relations disaster they had created. But Grace found herself focusing on the kind eyes of the security guard who had stepped in to protect her when her own husband had become her attacker. "What's your name?" she asked softly. "Bill," he replied, his voice equally quiet. "And I'm going to make sure you're safe. Mrs. Whitmore, I promise you that." There was something in the way he said it that made Grace believe him completely. Officer Janet Mills arrived within minutes, her patrol car's lights flashing as she pulled up to the mall's main entrance. She was a veteran officer who had seen her share of domestic disputes, but something about the radio call had suggested this situation was different. Bill had maintained his position near Grace, never leaving her side despite the chaos erupting around them. Brandon had grown increasingly agitated, demanding to know why he was being treated like a criminal when he was clearly the victim of his unstable wife's public breakdown. "This is ridiculous," Brandon declared as Officer Mills approached. I'm Brandon Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Construction. My wife is having some kind of pregnancy-related emotional episode, and this security guard is completely overreacting. Officer Mills looked around at the crowd of witnesses, noting their expressions and the way they had positioned themselves. In domestic situations, bystanders often revealed more than the participants about what had actually occurred. I'm going to need to speak with everyone involved, she said calmly. Let's start with what happened here. Before Brandon could launch into his prepared narrative, several witnesses began speaking at once. He slapped her. She's pregnant, and he hit her right in front of everyone. That woman with him was encouraging it. Officer Mills held up her hand for quiet, then looked at Bill. You called this in? Yes, ma'am, Bill replied, his tone respectful but confident. I witnessed Mr. Whitmore physically restrain his wife, then strike her across the face when she attempted to free herself. That's not what happened, Victoria interjected, stepping forward with her phone in her hand. I have connections at the mayor's office. This is harassment of a prominent businessman. Bill's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. Officer Mills, who had been dealing with entitled civilians for 20 years, recognized the subtle signs of someone who wasn't impressed by threats or political connections. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back while I conduct my investigation, Officer Mills told Victoria firmly. Do you know who I am? Victoria demanded. I know who you are now, Bill said quietly, his voice carrying an undertone that made Victoria step back involuntarily. The question is, do you know who you just threatened? There was something in his calm delivery that made both Brandon and Victoria pause. This wasn't the typical rent-a-cop they had dismissed. This was someone who spoke with quiet authority, someone who wasn't intimidated by corporate titles or political connections. Officer Mills, meanwhile, had knelt beside Grace, who was still sitting on the bench with her hand protectively over her belly. Mrs. Whitmore, are you injured? Do you need medical attention? Grace touched her cheek, which was already beginning to swell. I think I'm okay. The baby's been moving a lot since it happened. We should have you checked out at the hospital, just to be safe, Officer Mills said gently. Stress during pregnancy can be dangerous for both you and the baby. That's not necessary, Brandon said quickly. Grace is fine. She's always been dramatic about these things. The casual dismissal of his wife's well-being in front of a police officer showed either remarkable arrogance or complete stupidity. Officer Mills made a note in her notepad. Mr. Whitmore, I need you to step over here with me, she said, standing and moving away from Grace. We need to discuss what happened. As Brandon began his version of events, embellishing Grace's alleged aggression and minimizing his own actions, Bill remained beside Grace. She found his presence oddly comforting, as if he understood something about her situation that went beyond what he had witnessed. Thank you, she said softly. You don't need to thank me, Bill replied. No one should have to endure that kind of treatment, especially not when they're vulnerable. Grace studied his profile, noting the strong jawline and the way his eyes never stopped scanning their surroundings, as if constantly assessing for threats. You're not like other security guards. A slight smile crossed his face. I've had some experience with difficult situations. Military, something like that. His answer was vague, but Grace sensed there were depths to this man that his uniform and badge didn't reveal. Victoria had moved closer to where Brandon was speaking with Officer Mills, clearly trying to coordinate their story. She kept glancing back at Grace and Bill with increasing frustration, as if their calm composure was disrupting her plans. She's been stalking us, Victoria announced loudly enough for the crowd to hear, making our lives miserable with her jealousy and paranoia. Today was just the final straw. Several witnesses immediately contradicted her version of events, describing what they had actually seen. An elderly woman who had been shopping with her daughter stepped forward. That's not true at all, she said firmly. I saw the whole thing. That poor pregnant girl was just asking questions, and her husband got violent when she wouldn't be quiet about his cheating. Alleged cheating, Victoria corrected quickly. The elderly woman gave her a withering look. Honey, I saw you kissing him right in front of his pregnant wife. There's nothing alleged about it. More witnesses came forward. each contradicting Brandon and Victoria's version of events. It became clear that their attempt to reframe the situation was failing spectacularly in the face of multiple eyewitness accounts. Officer Mills returned to Grace after taking initial statements. Mrs. Whitmore, based on what I've heard from multiple witnesses, I have probable cause to arrest your husband for assault. However, I want to make sure you and your baby are medically cleared first. Grace felt a mix of relief and terror. Relief that someone in authority believed her. Terror about what this meant for her marriage and her future as a single mother. I don't know what to do, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Bill knelt down beside her chair, his voice low and reassuring. Right now, you don't have to do anything except take care of yourself and your baby. Everything else can wait. Something in his tone made Grace look at him more carefully. There was a protective quality to his concern that seemed almost paternal, as if he had a personal stake in her well-being beyond professional duty. Do you have family you can call? Officer Mills asked. Someone who can meet you at the hospital. Grace thought about her options. Her sister Rebecca would come, but she lived 2 hours away. Her mother Dorothy had always liked Brandon and might not believe what had happened. She had lost touch with most of her friends after marriage, partly due to Brandon's subtle discouragement of her social activities. My sister, she said finally. She's a lawyer. She'll come. Bill made a note in a small notebook he pulled from his pocket. The action seemed automatic, professional in a way that didn't match his security guard role. What's your sister's name? He asked. I can help coordinate with the hospital if needed. Grace found herself answering without question, trusting this stranger in a way that surprised her. Rebecca Foster. She works for Hartwell and Associates downtown. Bill nodded, making another note. Good firm. She'll know how to handle this situation properly. His familiarity with her sister's law firm struck Grace as odd, but she was too overwhelmed to question it. Instead, she found herself grateful for his competence and calm presence in the chaos surrounding her. As the ambulance arrived to transport Grace to the hospital for examination, Bill helped her stand and walk to the stretcher. His touch was gentle and respectful, but there was something about his protective positioning that reminded her of something she couldn't quite identify. Will you? She started to ask, then stopped herself. She had no right to ask this stranger to accompany her. I'll follow in my car, Bill said, answering her unspoken question. I need to give my full statement to the police, but I want to make sure you're all right first. As the ambulance doors closed, Grace caught sight of Brandon being led away in handcuffs while Victoria shouted at Officer Mills about lawyers and lawsuits and political connections. But her attention was drawn to Bill, who was already on his phone making calls that sounded far too important and authoritative for a mall security guard. For the first time in hours, Grace allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she had thought. The emergency room at Millbrook General Hospital buzzed with typical Monday afternoon activity, but Grace found herself in a private examination room within minutes of arrival. The efficiency with which she was processed seemed unusual, though she was too worried about her baby to question it. Dr. Sarah Coleman, the attending physician, was a woman in her early 50s with kind eyes and gentle hands. She performed a thorough examination while monitoring the baby's heartbeat, asking questions about Grace's stress levels and physical symptoms. Your blood pressure is elevated, which is concerning given your advanced pregnancy, Dr. Coleman explained as she reviewed Grace's chart. The baby's heartbeat is strong, but I want to keep you for observation for a few hours to make sure everything stabilizes. Grace nodded, relief washing over her at the news that her baby was unharmed. She had been terrified that the stress and trauma might have affected the child she had wanted so desperately. Is there someone I can call for you, Dr. Coleman asked. Your husband. Perhaps. My husband is the reason I'm here, Grace said quietly, touching her still tender cheek. Dr. Coleman's expression grew more serious. I see. What about other family? My sister is driving down from Hartford. She should be here soon. And, through the small window in her room, Grace could see Bill in the waiting area, still making phone calls. He had changed out of his security uniform into street clothes, and she was struck by how different he looked. The casual jeans and button-down shirt he now wore were expensive, well-tailored in a way that suggested significantly more income than a security guard typically earned. Dr. Coleman followed her gaze. Is that gentleman family? No, he was working security at the mall. He helped me when Grace trailed off, not sure how to explain the situation. When your husband assaulted you, the direct question surprised Grace. She had expected to have to convince medical staff of what had happened, to face the same skepticism Brandon and Victoria had tried to create. Yes, Bill stepped in to protect me. I don't really know him, but he's been incredibly kind. Dr. Coleman made a note in Grace's chart. Well, he's made quite a few phone calls on your behalf. The hospital administration received calls from some very influential people requesting that you receive the best possible care. Grace frowned. I don't understand. I don't know any influential people. Apparently someone does. Dr. Coleman's smile was knowing. Sometimes help comes from unexpected places. A knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Bill peered in, his expression concerned but respectful. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm sorry to disturb you. I wanted to check on how you're feeling before I give my statement to the detective. Detective? Grace asked. Yes, ma'am. Officer Mills called in a detective to handle the case given the circumstances. This is being treated as a serious domestic assault. Grace felt a mix of validation and fear. Validation that what happened to her was being taken seriously. Fear about the implications for her future. What circumstances? Bill exchanged a look with Dr. Coleman before answering. Your husband's public profile makes this a high-visibility case. The mall security footage is very clear, and there were dozens of witnesses. The prosecutor's office wants to make sure everything is handled properly. There was something in the way he spoke about prosecutors and legal procedures that suggested familiarity beyond what a security guard would typically possess. Grace filed the observation away with her growing list of questions about this man who had become her unlikely protector. I should probably call Rebecca and let her know what's happening, Grace said, reaching for her phone. Already done, Bill said gently. I spoke with her office. She's on her way and should be here within the hour. Grace stared at him. How did you get her contact information? Bill seemed to realize he had overstepped somehow. You mentioned her firm earlier. It was easy enough to look up. The explanation made sense, but Grace couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. Bill seemed to anticipate her needs before she expressed them, to have resources and connections that didn't match his apparent position. Dr. Coleman cleared her throat diplomatically. I'll give you both some privacy while I check on your test results. Mrs. Whitmore, try to rest. Stress isn't good for either you or the baby. After she left, Bill pulled a chair closer to Grace's bed. How are you really doing? And please, don't say you're fine. The gentle concern in his voice nearly brought tears to her eyes. After years of Brandon dismissing her feelings and needs, having someone genuinely care about her well-being felt overwhelming. I'm scared, she admitted. I don't know what happens now. I don't know how I'm going to raise this baby alone, or where I'm going to live, or how I'm going to support myself. You're not alone, Bill said firmly, and you're stronger than you think. How can you know that you don't even know me? Bill was quiet for a long moment, and Grace had the strange impression that he was carefully considering his words. Sometimes we can see strength in others, even when they can't see it in themselves. Before Grace could respond, her phone rang. Rebecca's number appeared on the screen, and Grace answered quickly. Rebecca, thank God. Grace, honey, are you all right? I got a call from the hospital saying you were in the emergency room. What happened? Grace began explaining the events at the mall, her voice breaking as she described Brandon's betrayal and violence. Rebecca listened with the focused attention of a lawyer and the protective fury of an older sister. That bastard, Rebecca said when Grace finished. I'm almost there. Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything. And don't talk to anyone from Brandon's legal team without me present. He has a legal team already. If he doesn't, he will soon. Men like Brandon don't go down without a fight, especially when their reputations are at stake. After ending the call, Grace looked at Bill, who had been listening to her side of the conversation with interest. Can I ask you something? She said. Of course. Why are you still here? Your shift at the mall must be over, and you've already given your statement. You don't owe me anything. Bill considered the question carefully. Everyone deserves protection when they're vulnerable, especially when the people who should be protecting them are the ones causing harm. There was something personal in his tone, as if he spoke from experience. Grace found herself studying his face more carefully, noting the laugh lines around his eyes and the silver threading through his dark hair. He was probably in his late 50s, old enough to be her father, but there was nothing paternal about his concern. It was more like the protective instinct of someone who understood exactly what she was going through. "Have you ever been married?" she asked, surprising herself with the personal question. Pain flickered across Bill's features. "Yes, a long time ago." "What happened?" "I made mistakes, put work ahead of family, lost the things that mattered most." He met her eyes. "That's why I recognize strength when I see it. You're fighting for your child, putting their needs first. That takes courage." Grace felt tears welling up again. "I don't feel courageous. I feel terrified and alone." "Being terrified and doing the right thing anyway is the definition of courage," Bill said quietly. Before Grace could respond, there was a commotion in the hallway, raised voices, including one she recognized all too well. Brandon had arrived, and he was demanding to see his wife. Bill's entire demeanor changed instantly. He stood and moved to position himself between Grace and the door, his body language shifting from gentle caregiver to protective guardian. "Stay calm," he told Grace. "No one's going to hurt you here." The conviction in his voice was absolute, and despite everything that had happened, Grace found herself believing him completely. Rebecca Foster arrived at the hospital like a force of nature, her designer suit and briefcase marking her as someone accustomed to taking charge of difficult situations. At 45, she was 5 years older than Grace and had spent her career defending women in domestic violence cases. The moment she saw her sister's swollen cheek and frightened expression, her professional and personal protective instincts merged into something formidable. "Where is he?" Rebecca demanded, embracing Grace carefully. "In the hallway, arguing with security about seeing me," Grace replied, leaning into her sister's familiar strength. Rebecca's attention immediately shifted to Bill, who had stepped back respectfully but remained alert to the situation in the corridor. "You must be the security guard who helped my sister?" "Bill Thompson," he said, extending his hand. "I'm glad you're here. Grace needs family support right now." Rebecca shook his hand while studying him with a lawyer's trained observation. "Thompson, are you related to Grace?" "No, ma'am. Just someone who was in the right place at the right time." Something in his answer made Rebecca pause, but before she could pursue it, Brandon's voice grew louder in the hallway. He was demanding his rights as Grace's husband, threatening legal action against the hospital, and insisting that he was the victim of a conspiracy. "I need to see what we're dealing with," Rebecca said, moving toward the door. Bill caught her arm gently. "Mrs. Foster, your brother-in-law is accompanied by his attorney and his companion. They're trying to control the narrative and paint Grace as unstable." The fact that Bill knew Rebecca's name without being introduced wasn't lost on her, but she filed it away for later questioning. Right now, her priority was protecting her sister. "What exactly did you witness at the mall?" she asked. Bill's account was precise and detailed, delivered with the kind of objective clarity that suggested experience giving testimony. He described not only Brandon's assault, but also the systematic emotional abuse that had preceded it, Victoria's deliberate cruelty, and the crowd's shocked response to the violence. "There's security footage from multiple angles," he added, "and at least 24 witnesses who recorded parts of the incident on their phones." Rebecca nodded approvingly. "Good. That makes this case much stronger." She turned to Grace. "Honey, I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you some hard questions about your marriage." For the next 30 minutes, Rebecca conducted a thorough interview, documenting patterns of emotional abuse, financial control, and isolation that Grace had normalized over 3 years of marriage. Bill remained quietly present, occasionally offering tissues or water, his protective vigilance never wavering. "He cleaned out our joint accounts this morning," Grace revealed, the admission painful. "I tried to use my debit card for parking, and it was declined. When I called the bank, they said Brandon had transferred everything to an account in his name only." Rebecca's expression grew grimmer. "That's financial abuse and potentially theft, depending on the source of the funds." "There's more," Grace continued, her voice growing stronger as she shared her burden. Victoria has been living in our vacation house in the Hamptons for the past 6 months. Brandon told me it was being renovated, but yesterday I found hotel receipts showing they've been there together multiple times. Bill made a note in his small notebook, the action so automatic that Rebecca noticed immediately. "Mr. Thompson, are you writing a report?" she asked. Bill looked up, seeming to realize his behavior might appear unusual. "Just keeping track of details. In situations like this, documentation can be important." Rebecca's legal instincts were fully engaged now. "What kind of work did you do before mall security?" "Various things," Bill replied vaguely. "I've always been interested in helping people in difficult situations." Before Rebecca could probe further, Detective Maria Santos knocked on the door. She was a woman in her early 40s, with compassionate eyes and the no-nonsense bearing of someone who had seen too much human suffering. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm Detective Santos. I need to speak with you about what happened today." Grace recounted the events once more, with Rebecca taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. Detective Santos recorded the interview while also documenting Grace's injuries with photographs. "Mr. Thompson," Detective Santos said when Grace finished, "I understand you were the first responder to this situation." "Yes, ma'am. I was working security at the mall when I observed the assault." Detective Santos consulted her notes. "Officer Mills mentioned that you seem to have significant experience handling crisis situations. What's your background?" Bill's pause was almost imperceptible, but both Rebecca and Detective Santos caught it. "I've had various jobs over the years. Crisis management, risk assessment, that sort of thing." It was a truthful answer that revealed nothing specific, delivered with the skill of someone accustomed to deflecting inquiries about his background. Dr. Coleman returned with Grace's test results, interrupting the increasingly tense questioning. "Mrs. Whitmore, your blood pressure has stabilized, and the baby shows no signs of distress. However, I want you to follow up with your obstetrician within 24 hours. "What about Brandon?" Grace asked. "Is he still trying to see me?" Detective Santos answered. "He's been arrested and charged with assault in the 3rd degree. He made bail an hour ago, but has been issued a restraining order requiring him to stay at least 500 feet away from you." Relief flooded through Grace, followed immediately by new anxiety. "What about the house? All my things are there." "We can arrange for a police escort to retrieve your belongings," Detective Santos said. "But you'll need somewhere else to stay tonight?" "She can stay with me," Rebecca said immediately. Bill cleared his throat. "Actually, that might not be the safest option. Mr. Whitmore knows where Mrs. Foster lives and works. If he violates the restraining order, he'll look there first." Both women stared at him. Rebecca voiced what they were both thinking. "How do you know where I live and work?" Bill seemed to realize he had revealed too much. "I may have done some research after Mrs. Whitmore mentioned you were her sister and an attorney. In situations like this, it's important to understand all the players." "What kind of research?" Rebecca's lawyer instincts were in full alert mode now. "Public records, professional directories, basic background information." The explanation was plausible but incomplete. Rebecca made a mental note to run her own background check on Bill Thompson as soon as possible. "Then where do you suggest Grace stay?" she asked. "I know a safe house that specializes in protecting women in domestic violence situations. It's secure, staffed 24 hours, and completely confidential." Detective Santos nodded approvingly. "That's probably the best option until we see how Mr. Whitmore responds to the charges." Grace felt overwhelmed by the rapid changes in her life. This morning she had been a married woman preparing for lunch with her husband. Tonight she would be in a safe house for domestic violence victims, preparing to raise her child alone. "I don't know how to thank you," she said to Bill, tears threatening again. "You don't need to thank me," he replied. "Just focus on taking care of yourself and your baby." As Grace prepared to be discharged, Bill stepped into the hallway to make a phone call. Rebecca followed him, her protective instincts now focused on this mysterious man who seemed to know too much and care too deeply about her sister's situation. "Who are you really?" she asked directly. Bill met her eyes steadily. "I'm someone who wants to see your sister and her baby safe and protected." "That's not an answer. It's the only answer I can give you right now." Rebecca studied his face, noting the lines of pain and regret that spoke of personal loss and hard-won wisdom. Whatever his story was, she sensed it was complicated and possibly tragic. "If you hurt her," she began. "I would rather die than see her hurt again," Bill said with quiet intensity. The declaration was so heartfelt, so personal, that Rebecca stepped back in surprise. This wasn't the protective instinct of a good Samaritan. This was something deeper, more personal, more invested. But before she could question him further, Grace appeared in the doorway, ready to leave the hospital and begin the next chapter of her dramatically altered life. The safe house was a converted Victorian mansion in a quiet residential neighborhood, indistinguishable from the family home surrounding it. Grace arrived there that evening with Rebecca and Bill, carrying only a small bag of essentials that Rebecca had retrieved from the house under police escort. Margaret Williams, the facility director, was a woman in her 60s who radiated both maternal warmth and steel backbone strength. She welcomed Grace with the practiced compassion of someone who had helped hundreds of women escape dangerous situations. "You're safe here," Margaret assured Grace as she showed her to a comfortable room on the second floor. "We have 24-hour security, and our location is completely confidential." Grace sank into the chair by the window, exhaustion finally overwhelming her. The events of the day felt surreal, as if they had happened to someone else. This morning she had been Mrs. Brandon Whitmore, respected wife of a successful CEO. Tonight she was a domestic violence victim hiding from her husband. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and this will all be a nightmare," she admitted to Rebecca and Bill. "I know it feels overwhelming," Rebecca said, sitting on the bed beside her. "But you did the right thing. You protected yourself and your baby." Bill remained near the door, as if sensing that the sisters needed space for private conversation. But Grace found his quiet presence comforting in a way she couldn't explain. "What happens now?" Grace asked. Rebecca pulled out her legal pad, which was now covered with notes and lists. "Several things need to happen quickly. First, we need to secure your financial situation. Brandon's attempt to hide assets before the assault suggests this was planned." "Planned?" Grace felt sick at the implication. "The timing is too convenient. He empties your accounts, then publicly humiliates you at the mall. This wasn't a moment of passion. Grace, this was calculated." Bill stepped forward slightly. "What kind of assets are we talking about?" Rebecca consulted her notes. "Their house is worth approximately $800,000. Brandon's business is more difficult to value, but based on public contracts, it's substantial. Then there are investments, retirement accounts, the vacation property." "The vacation property where Victoria has been living," Grace added bitterly. "Right. We need to document everything before Brandon can hide more assets." Rebecca looked at Bill. "You mentioned earlier that you had experience with this kind of investigation." Bill nodded carefully. "I have some familiarity with financial fraud cases. Asset concealment is a common tactic in domestic disputes." There was something in his tone that suggested more than casual familiarity, but Grace was too tired to pursue it. The baby had been active all evening, responding to her stress with constant movement that made sleeping impossible. "I should let you both get some rest," Bill said, noting Grace's exhaustion. "Will you?" Grace started, then stopped herself. She had no right to ask him to stay involved in her problems. "I'll check on you tomorrow," he said, answering her unspoken question. "And I'll be available if you need anything tonight." After he left, Rebecca turned to her sister with concern. "Grace, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Okay? Is there any chance you knew Bill before today? Any chance you've met him somewhere else?" Grace considered the question seriously. There was something familiar about Bill, something that made her feel safe in a way that went beyond gratitude for his help, but she couldn't place where that familiarity came from. "I don't think so. Why? He knows too much about you, about our family, about legal procedures, and the way he looks at you." Rebecca paused, choosing her words carefully. "It's not the way a stranger looks at someone they just helped." "What do you mean? Why, he looks at you like he cares about you personally. Not like a good Samaritan who did his civic duty, but like someone who has a personal stake in your well-being." Grace thought about Bill's gentle concern, his protective positioning, the way he seemed to anticipate her needs. He told me he'd been married before, that he'd made mistakes and lost what mattered most to him. Did he say anything else about his past? No. He deflects personal questions. Grace looked at her sister. You think he's hiding something? I think he's hiding everything, Rebecca said firmly. And tomorrow, I'm going to find out what. Meanwhile, across town in his luxury penthouse, Brandon paced furiously while Victoria lounged on the couch, painting her nails and seeming remarkably unconcerned about the day's events. This is a disaster, Brandon said for the 10th time. Do you realize what this could do to my reputation? To my business? Relax, Victoria said without looking up. So you slapped your crazy pregnant wife. It happens. We'll spin it as self-defense. Claim she attacked you first. There were witnesses, Victoria, and security cameras. Witnesses can be discredited. Security footage can be unclear. Victoria finally looked up, her expression calculating. The important thing is that we control the narrative from now on. Brandon's phone rang, and he answered it immediately. Whitmore? Mr. Whitmore, this is James Morrison from Morrison, Davis and Associates. I understand you need legal representation. Brandon felt some of his tension ease. Morrison was one of the city's most expensive criminal defense attorneys, specializing in protecting wealthy clients from the consequences of their actions. Yes, I need this situation contained immediately. I've already reviewed the preliminary reports. The charges are serious, but manageable. However, there are some concerning developments. What kind of developments? Your wife has retained Rebecca Foster as her attorney. Foster has a reputation for being particularly aggressive in domestic violence cases. But more concerning is that someone with significant resources appears to be supporting her case. Brandon frowned. Grace didn't have wealthy friends or family. Her parents had been middle class, and her sister, while successful, wasn't wealthy enough to mount an expensive legal campaign. What do you mean, significant resources? The hospital bills were paid in full immediately. She's been placed in the city's most exclusive safe house, which has a waiting list months long, and someone has already started a forensic audit of your financial records. That's impossible. Grace doesn't have access to our accounts anymore. Mr. Whitmore, whoever is backing your wife has resources that dwarf your construction company. This isn't just about domestic charges anymore. If they find irregularities in your business practices, Brandon's blood ran cold. His company's success had involved cutting corners, bribing inspectors, and using substandard materials to increase profit margins. If someone conducted a thorough investigation, find out who's helping her, he ordered. I'll do what I can, but Mr. Whitmore, you need to prepare for the possibility that this goes far beyond a simple assault charge. After ending the call, Brandon stared out at the city lights, trying to figure out who could be supporting Grace. She had been so isolated during their marriage, so dependent on him for everything. Where would she find a powerful ally? Victoria appeared beside him, having overheard enough of the conversation to understand the implications. Maybe we underestimated little Gracie, she said thoughtfully. What do you mean? I mean, maybe your mousy wife isn't as helpless as we thought. Brandon felt a chill of premonition. If Grace had hidden resources, hidden connections, then everything he thought he knew about his wife might be wrong. And if he was wrong about that, then his carefully constructed plans might be falling apart faster than he could control. Back at the safe house, Grace lay in bed unable to sleep, her hands resting on her active baby. She thought about Bill's words. Sometimes we can see strength in others even when they can't see it in themselves. For the first time in years, Grace was beginning to believe that might be true. Grace woke to the sound of quiet conversation in the hallway outside her room. Through the partially open door, she could hear Margaret speaking to someone in low, respectful tones that suggested the visitor was important. She's had a difficult night, Margaret was saying. The baby was very active, and I don't think she slept much. I understand, came the familiar voice of Bill. I just wanted to check on her and bring some things I thought she might need. Grace sat up carefully, her back aching from the unfamiliar bed. Through the window, she could see it was still early morning, probably around 7 o'clock. She had dozed fitfully, her mind racing with worries about her future and questions about Bill's mysterious background. A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Grace, it's Bill. May I come in? She wrapped herself in the robe Rebecca had brought her and opened the door. Bill stood in the hallway holding several shopping bags and what appeared to be coffee and pastries from an expensive bakery. "I thought you might not have had proper breakfast," he said, his concern evident. "And I picked up some things from the department store that Rebecca mentioned you needed." Grace accepted the coffee gratefully, noting it was prepared exactly how she liked it, despite never telling him her preferences. "How did you know I take my coffee with cream and no sugar?" Bill paused in unpacking the bags. Lucky guess, it wasn't a lucky guess, and they both knew it. Grace studied his profile as he arranged the items he'd brought, noting again the familiar quality of his protective concern. "Bill, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to be honest with me." He stopped what he was doing and met her eyes. "What do you want to know? Who are you really, and don't give me another vague answer about crisis management and helping people." Bill was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. "Grace, there are some things about my past that are complicated. More complicated than being 8 months pregnant and hiding from my abusive husband." The question seemed to hit him with unexpected force. He sank into the chair across from her, his composure finally cracking. "I've made mistakes," he said quietly. "Terrible mistakes that hurt the people I loved most." "What kind of mistakes?" "I was so focused on building my career, on achieving success, that I ignored what really mattered. I missed birthdays, anniversaries, school plays. I was physically present but emotionally absent." Grace waited, sensing there was more. "My wife gave me ultimatums, tried to make me understand what I was losing. But I was arrogant, convinced that providing financial security was the same as providing love." His voice grew rougher with emotion. "By the time I realized what I'd done, it was too late. What happened? She left me, took our daughters with her, said they deserved better than a father who saw them as obligations rather than priorities." Grace felt her heart constrict with sympathy. "How long ago?" 18 years. Bill looked up at her, and she saw pain etched deep in his features. "I haven't seen my daughters since they were children." The admission hung between them, heavy with loss and regret. Grace began to understand the depth of Bill's protective instincts toward her. She represented something he had failed to protect in his own life. "What were their names?" she asked softly. "Grace and Rebecca." The words hit her like a physical blow. Grace set down her coffee cup with trembling hands, staring at this man who had seemed like a stranger, but now. "Grace Michelle and Rebecca Lynn," Bill continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "My ex-wife insisted on keeping my last name for the girls, even though she reverted to her maiden name, Thompson." Grace felt the room spinning around her, the familiar eyes, the protective instincts, the way he knew exactly how she liked her coffee, the ease with which he had contacted Rebecca, his knowledge of her childhood nickname. "Gracie Bird," she whispered, the endearment she hadn't heard in 18 years falling from her lips like a prayer. Bill's composure finally broke completely. Tears streamed down his weathered face as he nodded. "Hello, sweetheart." Grace couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what was happening. Her father, the man who had disappeared from her life when she was 12 years old, had been protecting her in disguise. He had watched her husband assault her, had stayed by her side in the hospital, had arranged for her safety, all while she had no idea who he was. "You left us," she said, her voice cracking with 18 years of abandonment and hurt. "I didn't want to leave you," Bill said, reaching toward her, then stopping himself. "Your mother made it clear that unless I could prove I had changed, unless I could put family first, I wasn't welcome in your lives. So you just gave up." "No?" His voice grew stronger. "I never gave up. I've been watching over you and Rebecca your entire adult lives. Your college scholarship, your first job, the opportunities that came your way, I made sure you had chances to succeed." Grace stared at him in shock. "You've been manipulating my life for 18 years. I've been protecting it. There's a difference." The distinction that had seemed clear to him obviously wasn't clear to Grace. She stood abruptly, pacing to the window as she tried to process the magnitude of what he was telling her. "The security guard job at the mall. I own the building. I've been working different positions there for the past year. Waiting. Waiting for what? For the right moment to prove to your mother And to you girls, that I had changed, that I could put family first when it mattered most? Grace turned to face him, anger and confusion warring with a desperate hope she barely dared acknowledge. And yesterday was that moment. When I saw that man raise his hand to my pregnant daughter, nothing else in the world mattered except protecting you. The raw emotion in his voice broke through Grace's defenses. This was her father, the man she had missed desperately throughout her childhood and adolescence. But it was also a stranger who had been secretly orchestrating her life without her knowledge or consent. Does Rebecca know? Not yet. I was hoping you would help me tell her. Grace laughed bitterly. You want me to help you reveal that our dead father is actually alive and has been playing puppet master with our lives? I'm not dead, Grace. I'm right here. I've always been here. Being here and being present are two different things, Grace shot back, echoing the words she had heard her mother say countless times. Bill flinched as if she had struck him. You're right. I failed you both when you needed me most. But I'm here now, and I won't fail you again. How can I trust that? How can I trust anything you say when you've been lying to me my entire adult life? The question hung in the air between them, laden with years of hurt and abandonment. Bill stood slowly, moving toward her with the careful approach of someone trying not to frighten a wounded animal. Because yesterday, when it mattered most, I chose you over everything else. My company, my reputation, my carefully maintained anonymity. None of it mattered when someone was hurting my daughter. Grace looked into his eyes and saw the truth of his words. Whatever else William Thompson had become in the years since he'd left their family, his love for her had never wavered. It had been complicated, misguided, and sometimes controlling, but it had been constant. I don't know how to process she admitted, her anger giving way to overwhelming confusion. You don't have to process it all at once, Bill said gently. Right now, you need to focus on your baby and your safety. Everything else can wait. Grace placed her hands on her belly, feeling the child move restlessly inside her. Her baby, who would grow up with a grandfather they had never expected to have. Mom, she said suddenly. Does she know? Bill's expression grew complicated. Your mother and I have been in communication for the past year. She knows I've been trying to prove that I've changed. And what does she think? She's been watching to see if I would put family first when it really mattered. Bill's smile was sad but hopeful. I think yesterday might have convinced her. Grace felt tears threatening again, overwhelmed by the emotional whiplash of the past 24 hours. Her marriage had exploded, her security had been shattered, and now her supposedly dead father had returned from the grave to become her protector. I need time to think about all this, she said finally. Of course. Take all the time you need. Bill moved toward the door, then stopped. Grace, whatever happens between us, whatever you decide about having me in your life, I want you to know that being your father has been the greatest privilege of my life, even from a distance. After he left, Grace sank onto the bed, her mind reeling with revelations and possibilities. Her father was alive. Her father was wealthy. Her father had been protecting her all along. And her father had just proven that when it mattered most, he would choose family over everything else. For the first time since her world had collapsed, Grace began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she and her baby were going to be okay. Rebecca arrived at the safe house 3 hours later, armed with legal documents and a thunderous expression that suggested she had discovered something significant about their mysterious benefactor. We need to talk, she announced, setting her briefcase on the small table with more force than necessary. Rebecca, there's something I need to tell you first, Grace began, but her sister held up a hand. Let me go first. I ran a background check on Bill Thompson last night. Rebecca pulled out a thick folder. Grace, he's not just some security guard with a helpful nature. He's William Thompson, CEO and founder of Thompson Holdings, one of the largest private investment firms in the country. Grace nodded slowly. I know. You know, Rebecca stared at her sister. How do you know? Because he told me this morning. He told me everything. Rebecca sank into a chair, her professional composure wavering. Everything. He's our father. Rebecca. The words hung in the air like a bombshell. Rebecca's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, recognition, anger, and finally a kind of stunned acceptance. That's impossible. Dad died when I was 17. No, he didn't. He left because Mom gave him an ultimatum about choosing between his work and his family, and he chose wrong. He's been watching us ever since, waiting for a chance to prove he had changed. Rebecca was silent for a long moment, processing this revelation. As a lawyer, she was trained to evaluate evidence and adjust her theories accordingly. As a daughter who had mourned her father for over 20 years, the emotional impact was overwhelming. The scholarship money for your college, she said slowly. The job opportunities that seemed too good to be true. My first position at the law firm. All him, apparently. My God. Rebecca ran her hands through her hair. Do you realize what this means? Before Grace could answer, Margaret appeared in the doorway. I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a gentleman here to see you both. He says he's your father. Rebecca and Grace exchanged glances, then followed Margaret downstairs. In the common room, William Thompson stood by the window, no longer hiding behind the uniform and demeanor of a security guard. He wore an expensive suit that emphasized his successful transformation from the workaholic father they remembered to one of the country's most powerful businessmen. Hello, Rebecca, he said softly. Rebecca stared at him, seeing their father's features in the older, more weathered face. You son of a bitch, she whispered, then launched herself across the room to embrace him. The reunion was everything Grace had imagined and nothing like she'd expected. There were tears, recriminations, explanations, and slowly, tentatively, forgiveness. I've missed so much, William said, his voice thick with emotion. Graduations, careers, Grace's wedding. I wanted to be there for all of it. Then why weren't you? Rebecca demanded, the lawyer in her needing answers. Because your mother was right. I needed to prove I could put family first. Not just say it, but prove it through my actions. And yesterday was your proof. Yesterday was my moment of truth. When I saw Brandon raise his hand to Grace, nothing else mattered. Not my cover, not my business interests, not the years of careful planning, only protecting my daughter. Grace felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched her sister and father tentatively rebuild their relationship. But the emotional reunion was interrupted by Margaret, who appeared with a concerned expression. I'm sorry, but there's a situation developing outside. Several news vans have arrived, and there are reporters asking questions about Mrs. Whitmore. William's expression immediately shifted to protective mode. How did they find her? I don't know, but they're claiming to have information about yesterday's incident at the mall. Grace felt panic rising in her chest. The last thing she needed was media attention while she was trying to rebuild her life. I'll handle this, William said firmly, pulling out his phone. Grace watched in amazement as her father made a series of calls that demonstrated the full extent of his power and influence. Within minutes, he had mobilized security, contacted media relations specialists, and begun damage control measures that would have impressed a presidential campaign. The reporters will be cleared out within the hour, he reported, and I've arranged for alternative accommodations that will be completely secure and private. Alternative accommodations? Grace asked. My estate in Connecticut. It's private, secure, and large enough for you to be comfortable during the remainder of your pregnancy. Rebecca looked skeptical. Don't you think that's a bit much moving Grace to your house? Rebecca has a point, Grace said. I've just discovered you're alive. Moving in with you seems like a big step. William considered this carefully. What if Rebecca came too, at least initially, until you're comfortable with the arrangement? Before either sister could answer, Margaret returned with more urgent news. I've just received a call from the district attorney's office. Mr. Whitmore has hired a high-profile attorney who's claiming the assault charges are part of a conspiracy. What kind of conspiracy? Rebecca asked. They're alleging that Mrs. Whitmore has connections to organized crime and that yesterday's incident was staged to extort money from her husband. Horror. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. That's insane. How can they claim something so ridiculous? William's expression had grown cold and calculating. They're fishing. They know someone with significant resources is supporting you, and they're trying to create doubt about your credibility. Can they do that? Grace asked. Rebecca nodded grimly. Character assassination is a common defense strategy in domestic violence cases. They'll try to make you look like the aggressor or paint you as unstable. Then we need to get ahead of this, William said. I'm going to have my attorneys file a motion to expedite the criminal proceedings and simultaneously begin a civil suit for defamation. Grace stared at her father, watching him orchestrate a legal campaign with the same precision he had once brought to business deals. This was the side of him that had cost him his family the relentless focus on winning at all costs. Dad, she said quietly, using the word for the first time in 18 years. He stopped mid-conversation with his attorney and looked at her. I don't want to win this by destroying Brandon the way he tried to destroy me. I want justice, not revenge. William studied his daughter's face, seeing the strength and integrity that had somehow survived years of emotional abuse. This was his moment of choice. He could unleash his full power to obliterate Brandon Whitmore, or he could follow his daughter's lead and pursue a path of principled justice. What do you want me to do? He asked. I want you to help me build a new life, not tear down his old one. William nodded slowly, understanding that this was another test of whether he had truly learned to put family values ahead of his competitive instincts. Then that's what we'll do. As Grace watched her father adjust his strategy to align with her values rather than his own, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, William Thompson really had changed. And maybe, just maybe, they could finally be a family again. 3 weeks later, Grace stood before a packed courtroom, 8.5 months pregnant and radiating the kind of strength that comes from facing your worst fears and surviving them. The media attention had been intense, but William's security team had ensured her privacy while allowing her story to be told on her terms. Brandon sat at the defendant's table with his expensive attorney, looking nothing like the confident CEO who had struck his pregnant wife in public. The forensic audit of his company had revealed massive fraud, embezzlement, and safety violations that had put countless lives at risk. The mall assault had been the beginning of his downfall, not the end. Mrs. Whitmore, the prosecutor said gently, can you tell the court what happened on the afternoon of March 15th? Grace's voice was clear and steady as she recounted the events at the mall. She described Brandon's betrayal, Victoria's cruelty, and the moment when her husband's hand connected with her face in front of dozens of witnesses. And how did you feel when your husband struck you? The prosecutor asked. Shocked, Grace replied. Not just physically, but emotionally. This was the man I had trusted with my heart, my future, and my child's future. In that moment, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my marriage had been a lie. Brandon's attorney tried to discredit her testimony, suggesting she had provoked the assault and painting her as an unstable woman who had trapped Brandon with an unwanted pregnancy. But the security footage was unambiguous, the witness testimony overwhelming, and Brandon's own financial crimes spoke to a pattern of deceptive behavior that undermined any claim of victimhood. When Victoria took the stand in Brandon's defense, her testimony backfired spectacularly. Under cross-examination, she revealed the extent of their affair, the deliberate cruelty she had shown toward Grace, in her own involvement in hiding Brandon's fraudulent business practices. Miss Palmer, the prosecutor asked, did you encourage Mr. Whitmore to divorce his wife before the baby was born? I suggested it would be cleaner, Victoria admitted, not realizing how her words sounded to the jury. Cleaner for whom? For Brandon? For his reputation and his business. So you were aware that Mr. Whitmore was planning to leave his pregnant wife? Of course. That was always the plan. The admission sent a murmur through the courtroom. Grace watched as the jury's expressions shifted from skeptical to disgusted. Victoria had just confirmed that Brandon's assault wasn't a moment of passion, but part of a calculated plan to discard his wife and child. When the defense called William Thompson to testify about his relationship with Grace, the courtroom held its breath. The revelation that the mysterious billionaire supporting Grace was her supposedly dead father had been a media sensation. Mr. Thompson, Brandon's attorney began, isn't it true that you orchestrated this entire situation to gain leverage over my client's construction company? William's response was measured and devastating. Sir, until 3 weeks ago, I didn't even know your client existed. My only concern was protecting my daughter and grandchild from a violent predator. But you do have business interests that compete with Mr. Whitmore's company. I have business interests in dozens of industries. That doesn't mean I conspire to have their executives arrested for domestic violence. The questioning continued, but William's credibility was unshakable. He had built an empire through legitimate means, his reputation was spotless, and his motivation for helping Grace was clearly personal rather than business-related. When Rebecca took the stand as a character witness for Grace, her testimony painted a picture of a loving sister who had sacrificed her own ambitions to support her husband's career. Grace gave up her marketing career to support Brandon's business, Rebecca told the jury. She never complained, never demanded recognition, never asked for anything except to be treated with basic respect and fidelity. During closing arguments, the prosecutor summarized the case with devastating clarity. This is not a complicated case. A successful businessman decided to replace his pregnant wife with a younger woman. When his wife discovered his betrayal and confronted him publicly, he responded with violence. The assault was witnessed by dozens of people and recorded on security cameras. The defendant's subsequent attempts to hide assets and defame his wife's character only confirm his guilt. Brandon's attorney made a final desperate attempt to paint Grace as a gold digger who had somehow orchestrated her own assault to gain access to her father's wealth. But the timeline made such a conspiracy impossible, and the jury had seen too much evidence of Brandon's character to buy his victim narrative. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all charges: assault in the third degree, criminal harassment, and financial fraud. The judge sentenced Brandon to 5 years in prison and ordered him to pay full restitution to Grace for the hidden assets. As Brandon was led away in handcuffs, Grace felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only relief that this chapter of her life was finally closing. Outside the courthouse, she faced a wall of reporters and cameras. William and Rebecca flanked her protectively, but Grace had insisted on making a statement. "I want to thank the prosecutor's office for taking domestic violence seriously," she began, her voice carrying across the crowd. "But I also want to say something to other women who might be in similar situations." The crowd grew quiet, sensing this would be more than a standard victim impact statement. "For 3 years, I normalized behavior that should have been unacceptable. I made excuses for emotional abuse, isolation, and financial control because I loved someone and wanted to believe he loved me back. The physical violence was just the final step in a long pattern of abuse that I didn't recognize until it was almost too late." Kunita Grace paused, one hand resting on her very pregnant belly. "If you're in a relationship where someone makes you feel small, stupid, or worthless, that's not love. If someone isolates you from friends and family, controls your finances, or makes you afraid to disagree with them, that's not love. And if someone hits you, even once, that's never, ever acceptable." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. "I was lucky enough to have people who stepped in to protect me when I couldn't protect myself. Not everyone has that, but everyone deserves to be safe, respected, and valued in their relationships. Don't settle for less because you think it's all you deserve. You deserve so much more." As Grace finished speaking, she felt a sharp pain in her lower abdomen. She gripped Rebecca's arm, trying to stay composed in front of the cameras. "Grace," Rebecca asked, noticing her sister's sudden pallor. "I think," Grace started, then gasped as another contraction hit. "I think the baby's coming." The crowd erupted as William immediately took charge, calling for his car while Rebecca supported Grace. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Grace was going into labor on the day justice was finally served. As they rushed to the hospital, Grace felt a sense of poetic justice. Her daughter would be born on the day her father was finally held accountable for his crimes. It seemed like the perfect way to close one chapter and begin another. Emma Rose Thompson entered the world at 11:47 p.m. on the day of her father's conviction, as if she had been waiting for justice to be served before making her appearance. Grace held her daughter in her arms, marveling at the tiny perfect features and the way Emma seemed to study the world around her, with serious dark eyes that reminded Grace of her own father. "She's beautiful," William whispered, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as he looked at his granddaughter for the first time. "She looks just like you did when you were born." Grace smiled through her exhaustion. "I don't remember you being there when I was born." "I was there," William said softly. "I held you just like this, made promises about being the best father in the world. I failed to keep those promises the first time around." He looked up at Grace, his eyes filled with determination and love. But I won't fail Emma, and I won't fail you again. Rebecca, who had been documenting every moment with her camera, lowered the device to wipe away tears. She's going to have the most interesting birth story ever. Born on the day justice was served, Dr. Coleman, who had delivered Emma, smiled as she completed her final checks. Both mother and baby are perfectly healthy. Emma weighed 7 pounds, 2 ounces, and she has excellent reflexes and strong lungs. As if to prove the doctor's point, Emma let out a healthy cry that filled the hospital room. Grace adjusted her position to comfort her daughter, feeling a fierce protective love that she had never experienced before. I won't let anyone hurt you, she whispered to Emma. You're going to grow up knowing that you're loved, protected, and valued. William reached out tentatively, and Grace nodded, allowing him to touch Emma's tiny hand. The baby's fingers immediately wrapped around his index finger with surprising strength. Hello, sweetheart, William said softly. I'm your grandfather. I know that's complicated, but I promise to spend the rest of my life earning the right to be in yours. Over the next few days, as Grace recovered in the hospital, she was amazed by the transformation in her father. The driven businessman who had once prioritized deals over family now rearranged his entire schedule around hospital visiting hours. He brought flowers daily, not for show, but because he remembered that Grace had always loved fresh flowers as a child. When Emma fussed, William walked the halls with her, quietly singing lullabies that Grace dimly remembered from her own childhood. When Grace struggled with breastfeeding, he researched lactation consultants and arranged for the best one in the city to provide private consultation. You're different, Grace observed on her third day in the hospital, watching William rock Emma while she slept. I'm the same person I always was, William replied. I just finally have my priorities straight. What changed? William considered the question carefully. Losing you and Rebecca taught me that success means nothing without people to share it with. I spent 18 years building an empire, but it felt empty because the people I loved most weren't in my life. He looked down at Emma, who was sleeping peacefully in his arms. When I saw Brandon raise his hand to you, I realized I had a choice. I could maintain my careful anonymity and protect my business interests, or I could step forward and protect my daughter. For the first time in my adult life, the choice was easy. Dorothy Thompson arrived that afternoon, carrying a suitcase and wearing the kind of determined expression that Grace remembered from her childhood. At 56, Grace's mother was still a beautiful woman, though her hair was now silver and her face showed the lines of 20 years of single parenthood. Mom, Grace said, struggling to sit up straighter in bed. Dorothy went straight to her daughter, embracing her carefully before turning attention to Emma. Oh, sweetheart, she's perfect. Dorothy, William said quietly from his position by the window. The reunion between Grace's parents was less dramatic than the father-daughter reconciliation had been, but more emotionally complex. These were two people who had loved each other deeply, divorced painfully, and spent 20 years learning to forgive themselves and each other. William, Dorothy replied, her tone neutral but not hostile. Thank you for coming. Did you think I would miss meeting my granddaughter? Dorothy took Emma from William's arms with practiced ease. Besides, someone needs to help Grace navigate this transition. Grace watched her parents interact, noting the careful politeness that suggested years of tentative communication. How long have you two been talking? About a year, Dorothy admitted. Your father reached out when he learned you were pregnant. He wanted permission to be involved in some way. And what did you tell him? Dorothy looked at William, then back at Grace. I told him that he would have to prove he had changed, that words weren't enough anymore. And yesterday proved it. Yesterday proved that when it mattered most, he chose family over everything else. Turner and Dorothy's voice softened. That's all I ever wanted from him. Rebecca arrived with legal documents for Grace to sign, officially changing her name back to Thompson and establishing a trust fund for Emma that would ensure her financial security regardless of what happened with Brandon's assets. The civil suit is moving forward, Rebecca reported. Brandon's company is being liquidated to pay restitution to the families affected by his fraudulent construction practices. You should receive a substantial settlement. Grace nodded, but her attention was focused on Emma rather than money. Financial security was important, But what mattered most was that her daughter would grow up in a family that prioritized love over profit. Dr. Coleman released Grace from the hospital on a Friday afternoon, and William's security team escorted them to his estate in Connecticut. The house was a sprawling colonial mansion set on 50 acres of private land, with gardens, walking trails, and enough space for multiple generations to live comfortably. "This is where you grew up?" Grace asked, looking around the elegant foyer. "No," William replied. "I bought this after your mother left me. I kept thinking that if I built the perfect family home, somehow I could convince you all to come back." The admission was heartbreakingly honest. Grace looked around at the carefully appointed rooms, the family photos that had been removed when she and Rebecca left, the nursery that had been prepared with meticulous attention to detail. "You prepared a nursery? I hoped—" William's voice trailed off. "I hope that someday I might have grandchildren to spoil." Grace felt tears threatening again. This house wasn't just a mansion. It was a monument to lost time and hoped for redemption. Over the following weeks, Grace settled into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Dorothy had moved into the guest house to help with Emma, creating a three-generation household that somehow worked despite its complicated history. William proved to be a devoted grandfather, taking night feedings when Grace was exhausted, baby-proofing the entire mansion before Emma was even mobile, and reading to her from classic literature with the same intensity he had once brought to board meetings. "She's too young to understand Dickens," Grace observed one afternoon, finding William reading Great Expectations to a 2-week-old Emma. "It's never too early to develop good taste in literature," William replied seriously, then grinned when Grace laughed. These moments of lightness were balanced by more serious conversations about the future. Grace had decided to return to her marketing career, but she wanted to do it on her own terms. William offered to buy her an established firm, but Grace declined. "I need to build something myself," she explained. "I spent 3 years having my identity subsumed by Brandon's ambitions. I need to rediscover who I am independent of any man, even you." William's response surprised her with its immediate support. "Then let me help you by staying out of your way. But if you ever need anything, advice, connections, financial backing, just ask." The offer was made without conditions or expectations, a stark contrast to Brandon's controlling approach to her career. Grace began to understand the difference between supportive partnership and manipulative control. 6 months after Emma's birth, Grace opened Thompson Marketing Solutions in a small office downtown. She specialized in helping women-owned businesses develop their brand identity and reach their target markets. The work was fulfilling in a way her previous job had never been, because it allowed her to help other women achieve independence. Rebecca had also made changes in her life, leaving her prestigious law firm to open a practice focused on family law and domestic violence cases. She worked closely with Grace's foundation, which provided support and resources for pregnant women escaping abusive relationships. The foundation was housed in a renovated building that William had donated, but Grace insisted on running it according to her own vision rather than his business model. It was another test of whether he had truly learned to support rather than control. On Emma's first birthday, the entire extended Thompson family gathered at William's estate for a celebration. Grace watched her daughter take her first tentative steps across the lawn, reaching for the grandfather who had become her devoted caretaker. "She's going to be walking before we know it," Dorothy observed, settling beside Grace on the terrace. "I can't believe how fast this year has gone," Grace replied. "Sometimes it feels like the mall incident happened yesterday, and sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago." "Do you ever regret how it all turned out?" Grace considered the question carefully. A year ago, she had been married to a successful CEO, living in a beautiful house with what appeared to be a perfect life. Now she was a single mother running her own business, living with her parents and sister on her father's estate. "I regret that Emma will grow up without knowing her father," Grace said finally. "But I don't regret leaving Brandon, and I definitely don't regret finding Dad again." William appeared beside them, carrying a giggling Emma, who had grass stains on her birthday dress and frosting in her hair. "Someone got into her cake a little enthusiastically," he reported, settling Emma on Grace's lap. Grace looked at her father, noting the complete contentment in his expression. This man who had once commanded boardrooms and negotiated million-dollar deals now found his greatest joy in making his granddaughter laugh. "Are you happy?" she asked him, Happier than I have any right to be, William replied. I got a second chance that most people don't get. I'm not wasting it. Emma babbled something that sounded vaguely like Grandpa and reached for William, who immediately scooped her up again. Grace watched them walk back toward the party, William pointing out flowers and birds with the patience of someone who had learned that the smallest moments were often the most important. As the sun set over the Thompson estate, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she had been trapped in a marriage that was slowly destroying her spirit. The public humiliation and assault that had seemed like the worst moment of her life had actually been the catalyst for the best year she had ever experienced. She had reclaimed her independence, rebuilt her relationship with her father, strengthened her bond with her sister, and given her daughter a loving extended family. Most importantly, she had discovered her own strength and resilience. The sound of laughter drew her attention back to the party, where Emma was being passed among relatives who competed to make her smile. This was what family was supposed to look like, not perfect, but real, not without conflict, but willing to work through it, not afraid of vulnerability, but committed to protecting each other. Grace stood and walked back toward her family, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the support of people who loved her unconditionally. Emma would grow up knowing she was wanted, valued, and protected by a family that had learned to put love before pride and connection before control. As she rejoined the celebration, Grace caught her father's eye across the garden. He smiled and raised his glass in a silent toast to second chances, redemption, and the unbreakable bonds of family. She raised her own glass in response, toasting the man who had lost his family through his own mistakes, but had spent 18 years earning the right to win them back. Sometimes the greatest victories came not from never failing, but from learning to fail better and love deeper. The guardian who had disguised himself as a security guard was finally free to be what he had always wanted to be: a father, a grandfather, and a protector who put family first. And Grace Thompson, who had walked into that mall a year ago as a victim, walked back to her family that evening as a survivor, a mother, and a woman who had learned that sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead to the most beautiful transformations. Emma's laughter rang out across the garden, the sound of pure joy from a child who would grow up knowing she was unconditionally loved by a family that had found their way back to each other through courage, forgiveness, and the unshakable belief that it's never too late for a new beginning.